The early morning sunlight filtered through the towering courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. 9-year-old Tommy Adams sat on the edge of a wooden bench that felt impossibly large, his feet barely touching the ground. His bright blue backpack, faded from years of use but still his proudest possession, leaned against his leg like a faithful friend. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. Lawyers shuffling papers, clerks typing rapidly on keyboards, and the occasional whispered conversation. But Tommy noticed none of it. His attention was fixed on the intricate patterns in the wooden panels behind the judge's bench, counting and recounting the swirls to keep his mind off his growling stomach. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber, startling Tommy from his distraction. He jumped to his feet, his worn sneakers squeaking against the floor. Judge Maria Rivera entered the courtroom with measured steps, her black robe flowing gracefully as she took her place at the bench. Tommy thought she looked like one of those wise wizards from the books his teacher read in class, especially with her silver-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. The morning docket moved quickly. Adults in suits speaking words Tommy didn't understand, papers being passed back and forth, the steady rhythm of the judge's gavel marking the end of each case. Tommy's social worker, Ms. Chen, sat beside him, occasionally squeezing his shoulder reassuringly. She had helped him pick out his best shirt for today, a blue button-down that had once belonged to his cousin, slightly too big but freshly pressed. Case number 247, in the matter of Thomas Adams, the court clerk announced, her voice clear and professional. Tommy stood up, remembering Ms. Chen's instructions from their practice sessions. His small fingers fidgeted with the bottom of his shirt as he walked forward, trying his best to stand tall like his father always taught him. Judge Rivera peered down at the file before her, then looked at Tommy over the rim of her glasses. Her stern expression softened almost imperceptibly as she took in the sight of the small boy standing before her. Thin shoulders squared bravely, sandy brown hair slightly mussed despite obvious attempts to keep it neat, and clear blue eyes that met her gaze without hesitation. "Good morning, Tommy," Judge Rivera said, her voice gentler than it had been all morning. "Do you understand why you're here today?" Tommy swallowed hard and nodded, then remembered he was supposed to speak out loud. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice small but clear in the hushed courtroom. The words Ms. Chen had helped him practice felt heavy on his tongue. The morning light shifted, sending a warm beam across Tommy's face. He blinked, reminded of how the sun would shine through his classroom window during morning lessons, before his teacher, Mrs. Roberts, noticed he'd stopped bringing lunch to school. She'd started keeping extra apples in her desk, casually offering them during reading time as if she just happened to have too many. Judge Rivera shuffled through some papers, but her eyes kept returning to the boy before her. Something about this case felt different. In her 15 years on the bench, she developed an instinct for seeing beyond the files and facts presented to her. There was a story here, one that needed to be heard. "Tommy," she began again, setting aside the papers, "would you like to tell me about what happened at Mr. Parker's store?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the gentle whir of the courtroom's air conditioning and the distant ticking of the large wall clock. Tommy looked down at his shoes. The left one had a small hole near the toe that he colored in with black marker, then back up at the judge. What happened next would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Tommy's fingers traced invisible patterns on the smooth wooden railing in front of him as he gathered his thoughts. The courtroom remained still, waiting for his answer. A beam of sunlight caught a dust mote dancing in the air, reminding him of the sparkles in his little sister Emma's fairy wand, the one he'd helped her make from a stick and aluminum foil last weekend. "Well, Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness, "I was walking home from school past Mr. Parker's store. I usually try not to look in the windows because," he paused, cheeks flushing slightly pink, "because everything smells so good, especially when he bakes fresh bread in the afternoon." Judge Rivera nodded encouragingly, noticing how Tommy's shoulders relaxed slightly at her gesture. She'd set aside her usual stern demeanor, intuition telling her this case needed a gentler approach. That day, Tommy continued, I stopped because Mr. Parker had put out these new sandwiches in the display case. They had turkey and cheese and lettuce that looked really green and fresh. His hand unconsciously moved to his stomach. I watched people going in and out, buying them for lunch. One lady had two and threw half of one away. A small frown creased his forehead at the memory. Ms. Chen shifted in her seat, recognizing the mix of hunger and indignation in his voice that no child should have to feel. I had $2 from collecting bottles, Tommy explained, pulling a crumpled bill from his pocket as evidence. But the sandwiches were $5 each. I thought maybe. His voice trailed off, then strengthened again. I thought maybe Mr. Parker wouldn't notice if I just took one. Emma hadn't had breakfast that morning because we ran out of cereal and Dad's paycheck wasn't coming until Friday. Judge Rivera leaned forward slightly, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. And that's when Mr. Parker caught you. Tommy nodded, then added quickly, he was nice about it. He didn't yell or anything. He just looked sad. Tommy's blue eyes met the judge's directly. I'm really hungry, Your Honor. We're always hungry lately. But I know stealing is wrong. Dad works so hard, and he'd be really disappointed. A single tear rolled down his cheek, which he wiped away quickly with his sleeve. The honesty in his words resonated through the courtroom. Even the usually stoic bailiff seemed to be blinking more than usual. Judge Rivera removed her glasses, setting them carefully on her bench. In her years of service, she'd heard countless explanations, excuses, and apologies, but the simple truth from this small boy struck deeper than any practiced speech. Tommy, she said gently, can you tell me more about life at home? About your dad and Emma? Something in her tone made Tommy stand a little straighter. Dad's amazing, he said with fierce pride. He works at the factory during the day and drives for that food delivery app at night. Sometimes I wait up to hear his car in the driveway, just to know he's home safe. He smiled slightly. He always checks on me and Emma, even if we're sleeping. I pretend to be asleep sometimes, but I peek and see him fixing our blankets. And Emma. She's 6. And she's really smart. Tommy's face lit up talking about his sister. She just learned to read chapter books all by herself. But his voice dropped to almost a whisper. Sometimes she cries at night because her tummy hurts from being hungry. I tell her stories about magical feasts to help her fall asleep. Dad doesn't know about that part. I don't want him to worry more than he already does. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The morning sun had climbed higher, and now the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the floor, creating a kaleidoscope of light that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. Judge Rivera's expression shifted, and those who knew her well would have recognized the look that meant wheels were turning in her mind. She'd started this morning expecting to handle a routine case of juvenile shoplifting. Instead, she found herself face to face with a crisis that no child should have to bear, and a young boy whose strength and love for his family shone brighter than any law written in her books. Judge Rivera studied Tommy's face for a moment before gesturing to the bailiff. Mr. Johnson, would you please bring over that wooden chair for Tommy? I think this might be a longer conversation than we expected. The bailiff nodded, placing a chair behind Tommy, who carefully sat down, his feet still dangling above the floor. Tommy, the judge began, her voice warm. Tell me about your typical day. What happens when you wake up? Tommy's fingers played with the frayed edge of his shirt sleeve as he thought. I wake up at 6:30 every morning, he said proudly. Dad taught me to set my own alarm because he leaves for the factory at 5:45. I get Emma up at 7 o'clock and we get ready for school together. He smiled slightly, remembering something. I learned to braid Emma's hair by watching YouTube videos of the library. It's not as pretty as when Mom used to do it, but Emma says she likes it because I make sure not to pull too hard. The mention of their mother caused a subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Judge Rivera glanced at the case file, noting the absence of any maternal information. Your mother, she began gently. She went to heaven last year, Tommy said quietly, his voice steady but soft. She got really sick really fast. Dad says she's our guardian angel now. He straightened in his chair. That's why I have to be extra helpful. Dad works so hard, and I try to make things easier." Ms. Chen, who had remained quietly supportive throughout, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She'd known parts of Tommy's story, but hearing him tell it revealed layers she hadn't fully understood before. "What up, breakfast?" Judge River asked, steering the conversation back to immediate concerns. Tommy's cheeks flushed slightly. "We usually have cereal when there is some. Dad tries to keep the kitchen stocked, but sometimes things run out before payday. Those days, I tell Emma we're having a breakfast picnic at school." His voice brightened. "The cafeteria ladies are really nice. If we get there early, they let us help set up the breakfast line, and sometimes there are extra milk cartons or fruit that would go bad anyway." Judge River nodded, making notes. "And lunch?" Well, Tommy hesitated, then continued, "I get free lunch at school. Emma does too. I usually save half of mine for after school, especially the sandwich part. Emma's still growing, so she needs to eat her whole lunch." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if this rational distribution of food was perfectly normal for a 9-year-old to manage. "The tricky part is weekends," he admitted. "Dad always makes sure we have something for dinner when he's home, even if it's just rice and beans. But sometimes he has to work extra delivery shifts, so I try to help out." Tommy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "That's why I was at Mr. Parker's store. Emma had a stomach ache from being hungry, and I couldn't bear to hear her cry again." The sunlight that had been so bright earlier now felt softer, gentler, as if even nature was listening to Tommy's story. Judge River removed her glasses again, this time to wipe them carefully with a cloth, taking a moment to compose herself. "Tommy," she said finally, "do you have any other family nearby? Anyone who helps out?" He shook his head. "Grandma lives in Florida, but she's in a wheelchair now and can't travel. Our neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, sometimes bring us containers of soup. They say it's because they made too much, but," he smiled knowingly, "I think they just want to help. Mrs. Lee taught me how to make rice stretch further by adding vegetables." The wisdom in his young voice, the careful way he managed their hardships while protecting his sister's childhood, struck everyone in the courtroom. This wasn't just a case of shoplifting anymore. It was a story of a family trying their best to hold together, of a young boy shouldering responsibilities far beyond his years, and of a community that perhaps needed to open its eyes to the struggles happening right next door. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked steadily as Judge Rivera sat in thoughtful silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, she did something unprecedented in her 15 years on the bench. She stood up and stepped down from her platform. Her black robes whispered against the polished wood as she approached Tommy's chair. "Court is in recess for 30 minutes, she announced, her voice firm but gentle. The bailiff looked confused but nodded, and the few spectators in the gallery began to file out. "Miss Chen, would you mind staying with us?" Tommy watched with wide eyes as Judge Rivera pulled up another wooden chair and sat next to him, creating a small circle with Ms. Chen. From a large bag beneath her bench, she retrieved a brown paper lunch bag decorated with small doodles, clearly drawn by a child. "My daughter Emily decorates my lunch bags," she explained, noticing Tommy's curious glance at the drawings. "She's 8, just a year younger than you. This morning, she drew these butterflies and insisted I take this particular bag." The judge smiled softly. Sometimes children have wisdom we adults don't understand right away. Opening the bag, she pulled out a peanut butter and honey sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an orange, and 2 chocolate chip cookies. With careful movements, she unwrapped the sandwich and broke it in half. "Would you share lunch with me, Tommy? In my experience, conversations are always better over food." Tommy's stomach growled audibly, but he hesitated. "Are you sure, Your Honor? Won't Emily be sad you didn't eat your whole lunch?" Judge Rivera's eyes crinkled warmly. "Actually, Emily would be very happy to know I shared it with a new friend. She's always telling me I should make more friends at work." She held out half of the sandwich. "Besides, I've never had a lunch companion in my courtroom before. This makes it special." Carefully, Tommy accepted the sandwich half. As he took his first bite, the sweet honey and creamy peanut butter seemed to melt away some of the morning's tension. Ms. Chen watched the scene with misty eyes, her case notes forgotten in her lap. Now, Judge Rivera said, peeling the orange and separating its segments into 3 equal portions, I'd like to tell you about something that happened to me when I was just a bit older than you. She passed orange segments to both Tommy and Ms. Chen. My family also went through a very hard time. My father lost his job, and there were many nights when dinner was just rice and beans. Tommy's eyes widened. Really? But you're a judge now. Yes, really, she smiled, passing him a cookie. And you know what helped us get through it? People in our community who cared. My teacher who always accidentally packed extra snacks. The librarian who gave me a part-time job shelving books and let me take home the damaged ones that weren't really damaged. The grocery store owner who hired my father when nobody else would. She paused, watching as Tommy savored each bite of the cookie. Sometimes, Tommy, the bravest thing we can do is let others help us. It's not always easy, but it's important. The judge reached for her phone, her expression thoughtful. Would you trust me to make a few calls? I know some people in our community who might be able to help your family, just like people helped mine. She glanced at Ms. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. Tommy looked down at the remaining cookie in his hand, then broke it in half, then offered part to the judge. Okay, he said softly. But could we save some of the help for other kids too? I know I'm not the only one who gets hungry. Judge Rivera accepted the cookie piece, and if anyone had been watching closely, they might have seen tears shimmer in her eyes. Tommy Adams, she said, her voice full of warmth, you just gave me an even better idea than I had originally planned. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to glow a little brighter, as if acknowledging that sometimes the greatest changes start with something as simple as sharing a sandwich in a quiet courtroom. While Tommy finished the last crumbs of his shared lunch, Judge Rivera made several quiet phone calls from her chambers. Ms. Chen stayed with Tommy, teaching him how to make origami birds from some spare paper she found in her briefcase. His small fingers carefully creased each fold, creating a tiny fleet of paper cranes that paraded across the wooden railing. My mom used to say that paper cranes carry wishes to heaven, Tommy shared, carefully placing his best crane on the judge's empty chair. Maybe this one can tell her that I'm trying my best to take care of Emma, just like I promised. The courtroom doors opened, and Tommy looked up to see Mr. Parker himself walking in. The store owner wasn't wearing his usual apron, but rather a neat button-down shirt and tie. His kind face bore none of the anger Tommy had feared he might see. Instead, Mr. Parker carried a familiar paper bag with his store's logo, the one Tommy had tried to slip into his backpack just yesterday. Your Honor, Mr. Parker addressed the judge as she returned to the courtroom. Thank you for calling me. He turned to Tommy, his expression gentle. Young man, I believe we have some things to discuss. Tommy stood up straight, his voice small but clear. I'm sorry for trying to take the sandwich, Mr. Parker. It was wrong, and I won't do it again. Mr. Parker sat down in one of the chairs, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. You know, Tommy, I watched you for several days before yesterday. I saw you counting your coins outside the store, checking the prices, and walking away. I saw you giving your school lunch to your sister when you thought nobody was looking. Tommy's eyes widened in surprise as Mr. Parker continued. Did you know that before I owned the store, I was a math teacher? I still miss teaching sometimes. He glanced at Judge Rivera, who nodded encouragingly. How would you feel about helping me with some homework after school? Homework? Tommy asked, confusion clear on his face. Mr. Parker smiled warmly. Yes, you see, I need someone smart to help me check my inventory numbers, organize the shelves, and maybe learn a bit about running a store. It would be 2 hours after school, 3 days a week. The position comes with employee meals during shifts and a take-home dinner for the family. Plus, he added with a wink, there might be some math lessons thrown in, if you're interested. Judge Rivera watched as understanding dawned on Tommy's face. You mean, you want to give me a job? A real job? Well, Mr. Parker chuckled, let's call it an apprenticeship. You'll learn valuable skills, earn some pocket money, and help me keep the store running smoothly. Your sister Emma would be welcome to do her homework at the store too. I have a quiet corner that would be perfect for studying. Tommy looked at Ms. Chen, then at Judge Rivera, as if checking to make sure this wasn't a dream. The judge smiled and nodded. Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places, Tommy. Mr. Parker approached me during the recess with this idea. He doesn't want to press any charges. He wants to help. Mr. Parker reached into his paper bag and pulled out 3 sandwiches. I thought we might seal the deal over lunch. One for you, one for Emma, and one for your dad when he gets home tonight. What do you say, young man? Would you like to be my new assistant? Tommy stood perfectly still for a moment, processing everything. Then, with tears shining in his eyes but a bright smile on his face, he held out his hand just like his father had taught him. Yes, sir. I promise I'll work really hard. I know you will, Mr. Parker said, shaking Tommy's hand firmly. Now would you like to hear about your first assignment? I need help deciding what kind of cookies to bake for tomorrow's morning rush. The paper crane on the judge's chair seemed to glow in the afternoon light, as if carrying not just wishes, but hope for new beginnings to heaven. The bell above Parker's store door chimed cheerfully as Tommy pushed it open, right on time for his after-school shift. 2 weeks had passed since that remarkable day in court, and the store had already become his favorite place in the world. The warm scent of freshly baked bread wrapped around him like a hug as he made his way to the back room to put on his very own apron, forest green with Tommy, assistant manager, embroidered in gold thread. There's my right-hand man, Mr. Parker called from behind the counter, where he was arranging a display of colorful fruit. Ready for today's inventory challenge? Tommy grinned, pulling a small notebook from his backpack. Yes, sir. I've been practicing my decimals at school, just like you showed me. He paused to wave at Emma, who was already settled in her special corner. Homework spread across a small table Mr. Parker had found at a yard sale and refinished just for her. Excellent. Today we're going to learn about profit margins, Mr. Parker announced, his eyes twinkling. But first, how about we check on those multiplication tables while we stock the new shipment of canned goods? As they worked, Mr. Parker wove mathematics into every task. Counting inventory became a lesson in multiplication, pricing items taught percentages, and arranging shelves transformed into practical geometry. Tommy absorbed it all eagerly, discovering that numbers were much more interesting when connected to real-life situations. Mr. Parker, Tommy asked as they organized a new display, how did you know you wanted to be a teacher before becoming a store owner? The older man smiled, adjusting his glasses. You know, sometimes life takes unexpected turns. I taught math for 25 years before my wife and I bought this store. Now, instead of teaching in a classroom, I get to share knowledge while serving our community. He handed Tommy a calculator. Speaking of which, can you help me figure out how many loaves of bread we should bake tomorrow? Emma looked up from her homework, her face brightening. Tommy's really good at math now. He helped me with my fractions yesterday, and my teacher gave me a gold star. Is that so? Mr. Parker chuckled. Well, then perhaps Professor Tommy would like to explain to us how we can calculate the percentage increase in our daily bread sales. Tommy straightened proudly, remembering the formula Mr. Parker had taught him. As he walked through the calculation step by step, a customer watched with interest. Mrs. Rodriguez from the local diner. "Mi amor, you are quite the mathematician," she exclaimed, setting down her shopping basket. "Perhaps you could help me with my order calculations sometime. I always struggle with scaling up recipes." Mr. Parker's eyes lit up. "That's an excellent idea. Tommy, what if we made that your special project? Helping Mrs. Rodriguez with her bulk orders could teach you about large-scale calculations and business mathematics." Tommy's face glowed with excitement. "Really? I could help with the diner too." "Why not?" Mrs. Rodriguez smiled warmly. "You can be our little business consultant. And of course, consultants need to sample the products, perhaps some fresh empanadas for you and Emma." The afternoon continued to unfold like a beautiful tapestry of learning, friendship, and growth. When their father came to pick them up after his shift, he found his children bubbling with stories about their day. Emma proudly showing off her completed homework, and Tommy explaining the intricacies of inventory management with the confidence of a seasoned professional. Mr. Parker watched the family leave, waving goodbye as they walked home together. The store wasn't just a store anymore. It had become a classroom, a safe haven, and a bridge between people who might never have connected otherwise. As he locked up for the night, he smiled at the small paper crane that Tommy had placed near the register, a reminder that sometimes the best teaching moments come disguised as simple acts of kindness. 3 months had passed since that fateful day in court, and Parker's store was buzzing with unusual activity. Colorful balloons decorated the entrance, and a hand-painted banner reading "Happy Birthday, Tommy" stretched across the front window. Mr. Parker stood on a stepladder, adjusting the final streamers while Mrs. Rodriguez arranged a table of fresh-baked treats. Inside, Tommy was completing his usual afternoon inventory check, unaware of the surprise waiting to unfold. His confidence had grown remarkably. Gone was the nervous boy who once counted pennies outside the store window. Now he moved through the aisles with purpose, his green apron sporting several new pins: Math Whiz, Customer Service Star, and his proudest achievement, Junior Baker. "Tommy, could you help me in the back room?" Mr. Parker called, trying to keep the excitement from his voice. "I need your expertise with some calculations." As Tommy pushed through the storage room door, he was met with an explosion of joy. Surprise. The room was filled with familiar faces: his father, Emma, Judge Rivera, Ms. Chen, and even Mrs. Lee from next door. But what caught his eye was the enormous cake centerpiece, decorated with mathematical symbols and tiny fondant books. "Happy 10th birthday, Professor Tommy." Everyone cheered. Emma rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her brother. She looked healthier now, her cheeks fuller and her eyes brighter than they had been in months. "I helped decorate," she announced proudly. "Mr. Parker taught me how to pipe frosting flowers, and I only messed up 3 times." Their father stepped forward, and Tommy noticed something different about him. The perpetual worry lines on his forehead had softened, and he stood straighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was wearing a new shirt, one that wasn't worn at the edges. "Son," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I have some news to share on your special day." He glanced at Mr. Parker, who nodded encouragingly. "Starting next week, I won't be driving deliveries at night anymore." Tommy's eyes widened. "But Dad, what about?" His father smiled, the kind of smile Tommy hadn't seen since before Mom got sick. "Mr. Parker's brother owns a chain of grocery stores across the state. They've offered me a position as their regional distribution manager. Better hours, better pay, and—" He paused, squeezing Tommy's shoulder. "Most importantly, more time with my amazing kids." Judge Rivera stepped forward, holding a gift wrapped in paper covered with mathematical equations. "The community has noticed your hard work, Tommy, not just at the store, but how you've inspired others to help families in need." She gestured to a corner where several bags of groceries were stacked. "These aren't just for your family. They're the first donations to the new Kids Helping Kids food program you inspired. Starting next month, every Parker store in the region will have a special section where customers can buy and donate food for families who need a little extra help." Tommy stood speechless, taking it all in. The room suddenly felt warmer, fuller, not just with people and presents, but with the kind of love that transforms lives. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a tray of empanadas, the recipe she'd taught Tommy last week. "Make a wish, mi pequeño empresario," she said softly, gesturing to the candles on his cake. Tommy looked around the room, at his father's proud smile, Emma's excited bouncing, Mr. Parker's twinkling eyes, and Judge Rivera's gentle nod. He thought about that day in court, about paper cranes and shared sandwiches, about magic that happens when people choose kindness. "I don't need to make a wish," he said, his voice clear and confident. "Everything I could wish for is already here." Then he grinned mischievously. "But I wouldn't say no to learning how to make those cinnamon rolls Mr. Parker's been keeping secret." Laughter filled the room as Tommy blew out his candles, each tiny flame carrying away the shadows of harder times, making space for the brightness of new beginnings. 1 year later, Tommy stood in front of the town hall's packed auditorium, adjusting his tie, a miniature version of the one Mr. Parker wore on special occasions. The banner behind him read First Annual Community Connections Fair, and through the crowd, he could see his father beaming proudly from the front row, Emma bouncing excitedly beside him in her new dress. Judge Rivera stepped up to the podium, her familiar silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. "Today, we're going to hear from someone very special," she began, her voice warm with affection. "A young man who reminded our entire community that the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes. Please welcome Tommy Adams, the inspiration behind our Kids Helping Kids program." The applause echoed through the hall as Tommy took his place at the microphone. Gone was the hungry, frightened boy from that courtroom. In his place stood a confident 11-year-old wearing his assistant manager pin proudly on his lapel. "A year ago," Tommy began, his clear voice carrying across the silent room, "I was scared and hungry and thought I had to solve everything by myself." He paused, finding Mr. Parker's encouraging smile in the crowd. "But what I learned is that a community is like one of Mrs. Rodriguez's recipes. It takes lots of different ingredients to make something special." Laughter rippled through the audience as Mrs. Rodriguez called out, "And don't forget the secret ingredient, amor." "That's right," Tommy grinned. "Love is the most important ingredient. I see it every day now, in the donation baskets at Parker's store that are always full, in the study groups we hold after school where older kids help younger ones with homework, and in the community dinners where everyone brings something to share." He gestured to the displays around the auditorium, where local businesses showcase their involvement in the program. Thanks to everyone's support, Kids Helping Kids has spread to 15 stores across 3 counties. We've helped over 200 families, started 6 homework clubs, and he paused for effect. Just as Mr. Parker had taught him, we've made sure that no child in our community has to be hungry while trying to learn. Emma jumped up, unable to contain her excitement. "Tell them about the garden, Tommy." "Thanks, Em," Tommy laughed. "My sister's referring to our newest project, the Community Learning Garden. Mr. Parker helped us transform the empty lot behind the store into a place where kids can learn about growing food, healthy eating, and even some practical math and science. Did you know you can use geometry to plan garden beds? I didn't until Mrs. Lee showed us how." From her seat, Mrs. Lee dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while her husband proudly held up their phone to record the speech. "But the most important thing I've learned," Tommy continued, his voice softening, "is that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of trust. And when we trust each other, amazing things happen." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly worn paper crane, the same one he'd made in the courtroom a year ago. "My mom used to say that kindness is like a paper crane. It might look delicate, but when folded with care, it's strong enough to carry wishes to heaven. I think she'd be proud to see how many wishes have come true." Judge Rivera stepped forward again, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Thanks to Tommy's story, we've established a permanent fund to help families in need. But more importantly, we've rebuilt the connections that make a community strong." As Tommy returned to his seat, the applause was thunderous. His father wrapped him in a tight hug, whispering, "Your mother would be so proud of you, son." Looking around the auditorium, Tommy saw not just faces, but stories. Mr. Parker teaching a new young assistant, Mrs. Rodriguez training aspiring bakers, Judge Rivera mentoring teen volunteers. Each person represented a thread in the tapestry of kindness that had transformed their community. The paper crane sat in his pocket, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage, like a hungry little boy telling the truth to a kind-hearted judge.